I thought I'd begin with just speaking a tiny bit about trauma, because we've been hearing about non-duality all weekend for the last few days, and we have been hearing some about trauma, but not too much. And what I want to say is, if you have a body, then it's likely that you have experienced trauma, and that there are various degrees of trauma that one can experience. And it doesn't have to be one huge event like a car accident or a rape or a molestation. It can be one event of childhood of being left to cry for too long, which overwhelms the system and creates a dissociation of the self out of the body. And if that is not repaired by a caregiver, that creates trauma that could live in the system for a lifetime. And you could go on and become a very successful professional person, or a non-dual teacher, or anything in between, and still be carrying trauma. And you may never know, although quite often trauma does speak to us through psychological symptoms, as well as things like headaches and depression, panic, anxiety, and inability to regulate our nervous system. So really, any one of us here could be sitting with trauma and either be aware of it or not be aware of it. So saying that, I'm going to begin by what Richard and I have just mentioned a little bit, the myth that if you open up to non-dual awareness, that which is already present, but if that becomes unobscured, that there's an idea that then you no longer have trauma. And I'd like each one of you to speak to that. Maybe you could begin, Richard.
Sure. I think there are these two processes. One is, if we're just looking at awakening, there's awakening up and out, where we really do experience our loss of separation, our loss of self, and where there might even be this moment where self disappears so entirely, there is no intensive purpose, as someone there registering where we've come to. And then as we return, but there is this waking down and in that to me is very important as we integrate it into all of our emotions, as you were talking about, Scott, all of our emotions, our thoughts, our body sensation, because we are a living human being. So until it's fully integrated into every aspect of our life, it's not a full, to me, process that's been engaged. There's a, to me, moment where when we're working with trauma, if we're really serious with people, or where we're working with meditation, where we're really opening the trap door to our psyche and shouting in, hopefully, you're all welcome home. And then I like to tell people, make sure that when you do shout that in, say also, get in line, would you please? And get it in an orderly line, and I'll take you all, but the ones who really need to come first. And I liked what you commented on, Scott. For me, the word we use is welcoming. Everything is welcome to be here, because everything is an aspect of ourselves. So why would I want to get rid of a thought or an emotion or a sensation? I look at them as messengers. They're here for us to gallop on our way as we learn to listen to the feedback of our body, our mind, our senses, our emotions, and our thoughts. We see right actions that we need to take. By taking them, those messengers have served their purpose. They go on their way, and there's a deeper healing into the trauma. So I think, as you were saying, we all have experienced trauma to one degree or another. And I think the work is the same for whether we've come back from war, we've lost our home, we've been rescued from human trafficking, or, like most people, we're just going about our life. But we've had trauma. Separation is, to me, the first trauma we all experience.
What comes up for me is just how we live in a culture, at least in the West, of wanting to be fixed. And it's quite natural and very prevalent. And so it so easily gets into the non-dual conversation. So the idea that I shift into that open awareness and somehow that's going to fix me, it's a false myth for most people. And I don't know this because I have scientific proof of it. I know this because just working with thousands of people many of whom have shifted into that and still had this unresolved trauma. And it can be frustrating because they also still have this cultural belief of wanting to be fixed because of the basic belief that they are a broken self, which Richard talked about, which we call a deficiency story. It's challenging. I think the challenge with these teachings is to help guide people into the allowing of everything to be as it is, even the feeling, but in a way that's safe, especially around trauma, so that they can, so that it's not about I'm fixed or I'm not fixed, or I'm enlightened or I'm not enlightened. It's no longer about that. I'd like to just throw all of that out, if we could, and start talking about experience and being with the experience in a different way. And I think when we do that, we will mature overall around this whole topic of trauma and addiction. We'll just have a more mature conversation about it. I just think we've inherited a myth that we have to dispel. There may be a fraction of people out there who have an awakening experience, who all of their trauma and issue has sort of been seen through. It's a very small fraction of people. And I know that there are people who have had an experience and they say, well, trauma just arises then, or everything just arises within that, which is obviously true on one level. But it's our relationship to that is the key, I think. And whether we are avoiding the issue, finding these elaborate ways to avoid the issue, really allowing things to surface and learning to be with them skillfully. And that's how I think the healing happens. And it's not about a quick fix, really, for most people. It's different for everybody. But that's really the main point I want to take. Can we finally get done with this whole myth that an awakening experience is the end?
Oh, thank you.
Can I riff off one thing?
Yeah.
Which is something I'd love for everybody here to ask. It's something that I'm asking of myself, which is feel how you take this in. I'm safe with myself. Because in trauma, we get disconnected. We don't feel safe with ourselves. So I would highly recommend taking that on as an inquiry. I'm safe with myself. Is that true? How can we do our work in such a way that we feel totally safe with ourselves? Because the world out there, in a manner of speaking, isn't safe. How are we safe with ourselves?
And that we can explore that a little bit more. I'll come to you in just a second, Russ. Yeah. The safety, that we need to somehow feel safe in our bodies to become embodied. So it's safety is key in the resolution or the healing of trauma. So about this myth, Russ, I know you have some things to say about it.
Yeah. I was very moved listening to you earlier, Scott, talking about your story. And I can speak from experience. I was doing inner work. I was in spiritual schools. I was precociously dropping into various non-dual conditions, realizations. They were recognized by my teachers as such. I was even able to teach people about them. And I one day woke up and some things had gone wrong in my life. Relationship breakup, friend dies, just several things at once. And I found myself suicidally depressed. How could it be? How could it be? I knew what was what. I know that it's all consciousness, etc. But there were elements in me that did not have that news. What I started to notice, and what I'm always on the lookout for in my own consciousness, so to speak, and in that of people I'm working with, the authentic unitive consciousness is loving and responsive. It is not taking a vacation from reality. It is not saying, oh, it's all one, so I don't have to bother. Such that when we have such an awakening, the first thing that consciousness does is find the next part in us that needs loving attention. It finds the next internal orphan that's inside us. Now, if we don't understand that, we can think we're flunking.
Yeah.
We can think, oh, God, I was so awake, and now I'm in this terrible state. No, it makes sense you're in the terrible state because the non-dual awareness we're all talking about is also love and compassion. And so it finds these split off elements of our psyche and holds them. So I'm always on the lookout for, do I feel I've crossed the finish line and you poor mortals will carry on? That might be a little egoic, just a bit. Or am I absolutely here, available and responsive? The other thing I notice about non-dual consciousness is the authentic non-dual consciousness is breathtakingly sensitive, breathtakingly vulnerable, affected by every little thing here. It's like, whoa. And you can just feel that wave move through you. Now, obviously, we're born that way, and it's given the nature of planet Earth at this stage in our evolution, is too much. We have to learn ways to turn it down, turn it down, turn it down. There are, of course, these horrible disruptive experiences like accidents, like violence, like neglect, like abuse of various kinds, and they're really gonna, but just the experience of landing on planet Earth, just the experience of being born. Let's listen to Stan Grof talking about the birth process, right? We learn to shut down in stages and identify with some kind of psychological coping mechanism that is to protect us from how overwhelmingly vulnerable we feel. And the real awakening is that vulnerability. Now, we then make an identity out of our defensive pattern. Your Enneagram type is not your identity. It's how you learn to manage your experience of reality. So to become aware of it with kindness is to begin to see how we learn to cope and survive. Spot on, brilliant, great job, good thing we learned how to do it. But then to come into the contact with what is popularly Eugene Gendlin, right? The felt sense. The felt sense. How do we come back to that? And it's trauma that alienates us, that splits us off from that makes it impossible to live and embody the non-dual experiences that we've had, where we're not just walking around with a memory of a cosmic experience we had in 1989 and talking the talk, but actually living a more ongoing sense of being that presence. And I don't think that's possible at all without addressing this level of inner suffering, individually and collectively.
Yeah, great. Nice, Russ. Would either one of you like to respond to that? I have something to say to...
No, I thought it was so perfectly stated. I was just happy to clap. Yeah, I mean, if something comes up later, I'll share.
Okay. So let's come to the body for a moment. So trauma lives in the body. It's not in the actual events that are happening out there. And so the body can actually become a very terrifying place to live. So on a journey of healing trauma, at some point we want to hopefully come back to the body. Like I always say, we have a body in this universe. I don't think it's an accident. I think we're meant to be here and to actually be in it. And the nature of trauma quite often dissociates us from the body. And so safety, the idea of safety here in the body can be part of this next question. But to really speak to, if the body is a place where there's terror, how do we begin to touch back into the body and find safety? Without re-traumatizing ourselves or reliving, which is not the thing we want to do.
Yeah. So at the center, we use a lot of different ways to do that. Creating an atmosphere of safety, breathing, certain ways of breathing is to relax the system. One of the main ways, though, is, again, the undoing the Velcro. Because if I go into my body with unexamined thoughts about my own safety or who I am or external stimuli, if I have those thoughts sort of embedded into the feeling feels more monstrous than it really is. And of course, I don't want to sit with that. However, if I can pull out these things in isolation by undoing the connection between them, seeing that the words, I'm really afraid, are words that have a different quality than the sensation. The sensation is being sensed, the words are being seen or heard. And then in seeing that, there can be the relaxation of the words, and then it's just a little bit safer to go back into the feeling. So it's like making it safer and safer to go back into the feeling as you mine out material from it,
Mm-hmm.
one by one. And that is really helpful for trauma, because if you say to somebody who's experiencing a traumatic thing, just sit and feel it, it doesn't work.
No.
I mean, I can't say it doesn't work for everybody. It's too much too soon.
Mm-hmm.
So there has to be some approach, I think. I think there's many different approaches, really, that make it a process that's doable and gentle and helpful and effective.
Yeah, thank you. Richard.
There's, to me, a difference between dissociation, which is a natural defense that we all have inherited. When we're overwhelmed by too much information, we will split it off into the psyche, into the body, versus disidentification. Disidentification entails a return for that material, welcoming it back into our awareness and engaging it with this welcoming attitude that we're talking about here. I find it really important to help a person first see if they can access within themselves a place where they feel secure or at ease, or where at some point in their life they've been able to find peace or well-being. I don't use the word safety because a lot of the people that I work with have never felt a day in their life when they felt safe.
That's right.
But they can imagine by a stream or petting a dog or some experience, we welcome that feeling into the body. To me, the safest place we could potentially ever experience is the unchanging felt sense of being, because it's here whether we're feeling safe or unsafe, whether we're feeling grounded or ungrounded. It is, to me, the most groundedness we could ever experience. So I think it's very important to see if we can access some sort of inner safety, ease, and then to begin to touch, and as you're saying, Scott, to titrate very slowly thoughts, feelings, images, memories, and weave in this sense of safety. What I'd like to see is that eventually we've woven it so well into the tapestry of our being that ultimately when you start to feel anxious or fearful or some other experience, a thought, that sense of well-being comes in with it and emerges, co-arises, I might say. Then I know that it's really in place. And it becomes then a kind of an unconscious movement. We had one vet who had been succumbed many times to road rage, and we really worked with him to install this, what we call inner resource, not to install it, but to find it within himself. And he said it was new. He knew it was working when one day an 18-wheeler cut him off. He was in his mind fantasizing going into the parking lot, yet again pulling the cab driver out and beating him to a pulp. And he said as his whole body was orienting that way, his arms and hands were pulling the steering wheel in an opposite direction. We're trying to instill this quality of being that responds rather than reacts, even when a reaction may be going on in the mind. And one last piece, we do a lot of work with body sensing, because until the body is sufficiently awake, we can't access the deep information, because we know a thought, we know an emotion, we know a picture, we know an image and a memory because we can sense it. And so having access to the body and developing it carefully so we don't overwhelm too much information at once, we have that ability to become so sensitive that we can access small amounts of information before they become big pieces of information. So I think welcoming the body, learning how to really have a sense of safety that we can emerge with whatever is arising and titrate back and forth, and give that person a sense that when they're starting to feel something that's emerging and they start to feel overwhelmed, they can go right back to that ground of safety or being, ground there, and then come back a little bit of time, titrating back and forth, back and forth.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank
Yes.
you. Just to add to that a little bit, image and metaphor can be wonderful ways to begin to access the body, because they can convey an emotional truth in a way that we can assimilate it without being overwhelmed. And these, of course, are very right brain processes. The right brain is very much connected to the processes of
And it
the
is
body.
one thing I think is very important to say, have a metaphor, have an image that access one side of the brain, the right side say, and then to have a person describe that accesses their other side, and by weaving them back and forth, both describing, experiencing, we interweave the brain back together, and we see a great healing come out of that.
Yeah, it's certainly a whole body, whole brain process.
Yeah. Yeah, I find that with, when I'm working with students, we begin all of our developmental work with sensation. Drawing on that marvelous Sufi expression, the soul is an ocean, the body is the beach. If you want to go to the ocean, you have to go to the beach. The idea, again, that it's through the body that we have some access to something other than our programmatic discursive mind and our programmatic reactive emotions. There's something else here. The body, in most traditions, working with breath and sensation, does that. But occasionally I'll have students, and I was probably one of them myself at the beginning, where it was so much trauma that we couldn't access it at first. So in terms of practical things, there's a couple things. One is little, as you gentlemen and you, Julie, were saying, little steps at first. Work where it's easy, and then you can build up to places where it's hard. That's one thing. Our humility and understanding the kind of enormity that these, what seem like little changes, are not small things for a human being. It's a huge shift. The other two things that are also implicit in the beautiful work all three of you do is context. I was chatting with Charles Eisenstein yesterday about the importance of context. What you're doing with your centers, what you're doing with your clients, is creating a context where something can happen that is not a repetition of the previous track in the brain that trauma has marked out. Where suddenly, where bad things don't happen, I breathe and there's somebody hasn't abandoned me. They're still there. I'm okay. I'm feeling rage and nobody's getting killed. Like those settings, and this, I say this because in the movement, the slow evolutionary movement, whatever is happening on this planet, if it remains all of us thinking we've got to do this by ourselves, we are in big trouble, right? It's just not possible unless we're in community, unless we're helping to recreate contexts where people can be as freaked out as they actually are and not feel shamed.
Yeah.
Right? Not feel shame that they're not in some higher consciousness. We have higher consciousness when we have higher consciousness. You're as awake as you are now. And being awake now is being awake with whatever the hell you're experiencing. Right? There is nothing else possible. Everything else is a groovy place to sort of put ourselves, but that's not what we're looking for. The other context, yes, context and willingness. Like, that's the courageous part of us as individuals, understanding that if we want to move to what we love, we need to be willing by little steps, not pushing ourselves off cliffs, but just seeing and moving in the direction of that vulnerability, moving in the direction of what we know scares us. What we don't want to deal with is always the cork in the bottle we're trapped with, and we know what it is, right? We don't know all the elements of that. We're going to keep finding layers. But our own willingness to be with the suffering. People talk about presence, and I'm a teacher of presence. We talk about being. There is no such thing in my experience as presence that isn't presence with. There is no being that isn't being with whatever you're experiencing. And as we develop, what I think happens through context, skill, willingness, is trust. Trust in reality. That is what has been so radically lost. So much so that we even will concoct out of our desperate psychological mechanisms trying to handle all this, we'll make philosophies, airtight philosophies, to make sure this stuff will never get to us. Right? So, we need to be humble, human, very kind, very patient, and understand that we can't do it alone. That's what I'd add to the conversation. And I just salute you guys for the sincere work that you're doing for trying to create contexts in which individuals can make those steps and flower. I mean,
Yeah.
I can't think of anything more important in this world.
You know, you're making a good point, which is there's a piece of work I think we need to do by ourselves.
Yes.
And we can do that both by ourselves, but also by facing an actual literal a mirror of ourselves, so we're really making contact with ourselves. And I think there's another piece that we can only do with another human being, because that brings up a whole scary piece of social animal. And then I think that third one, which you're talking about, is there's a piece we need to do as a group, so that we can feel those scary places within the group and realize that we're going to all have lunch together rather than I'm going to be lunch for everybody. And to really feel a sense of safety in the group. And we need that tribal sense. And I think that's why we try to do our work both individually and a lot in group to set that context.
Yeah. It does make so much sense that we need community, because I think back when I was a kid, you know, and I was experiencing fear and anger and sadness. You know, I mean, I've said this before, but how many of your parents said, okay, now just come down and feel that, and be with that very quietly. You know, it didn't happen. So our communities taught us how to relate to our experience in a way that created unresolved trauma and later addiction and all these things. So it has to be a collective effort that we reinforce with each other to create safe, trusting environments to experience ourselves and our lives, our experience differently, because we learned it through community. You know, we have to sort of unlearn it or relearn it a different way with the help of each other. That's what's so great about having the centers, because it's a 24-hour support system, so that it's constantly being reinforced, this place of this trusting environment where the whole conversation is around learning to relate differently to experience, to try to help undo the programming that said, boys don't cry, it's not okay to be afraid, there's nothing to be worried about, don't be angry. You know, and meanwhile, we are feeling human beings. I mean, these are natural emotions that we were having, and somehow we learned that they weren't okay. You know, we can't keep sending that signal out that it's not okay to feel.
And so what happens to all of those emotions that we were told not to feel? They don't just go away because we're told not to feel them, they get disconnected.
Right.
The energy of them can get stuck in the body and the nervous system. They can get, you know, dissociated out of us. And this, I think, is where healing trauma can get a little bit tricky, because what you're all saying is really very important. We want to address trauma very carefully. We want to titrate it. I think Peter Levine introduced that word. You know, it comes from chemistry, sort of using just a little bit at a time, dealing with a little bit at a time. And so we can assimilate it and assimilate it safely, and that way we can integrate these energies back into us. But just talking about our trauma isn't very helpful. In fact, it can be re-traumatizing, because as we talk about it, it can allow all of that dissociated affect come flying through. You know, it can be very dysregulating. But also, on the other hand, just coming to sensation and feeling the body, that can do the same thing.
Yes.
So can meditating. So one can sit and meditate and try and touch into into our being. And what can happen, which is really lovely, is this separate self-contraction begins to release. And isn't that lovely? But it can drop us right back down into the body, where we feel that terror and that pain and that anger, and that energy can come through us, and we can become very, very traumatized. So in this discussion on engaging trauma and spirituality, I think those are some of the pieces that could be important to become more familiar with. These edges that can be a little bit dangerous.
You know, there's a piece, and it's touching what you were talking about, Russ. If the environment is a safe environment, so if I'm working with someone and truly I feel this sense of whatever you're bringing to the table is welcome to be here, even though they may not feel within themselves they can welcome it. they're sitting in a field of welcoming that later on I find they will comment on. They said, even though I didn't feel safe, something in me knew there was a context here that I could open this up to.
Yes.
And we know that any intervention we utilize at some point may start to erupt these kinds of unsafe feelings or overwhelm. So I think the environment that is a kind environment, as you were talking about, Russ, that does really truly welcome, that isn't trying to fix or change. A person begins to really feel that you're really not trying to fix and change me, even though I'm still in the fix-it mentality. There's something here that's really important to get a hold of.
Yeah.
Yeah. One of the great gifts, I've for many years studied with A.H.L. Moss. He's one of my mentors and friends, and he showed me how essential it is, the capacity, if we're in the role of creating context, facilitating, to simply be with people. It's like if you think of when you're going through a traumatic experience, let's say you've just lost a loved one, and you're going through all the attendant emotions. I notice in those states, when people come up to me, they're trying to tell me some metaphysical thing of where my loved one is, thank you. Or they're trying to say they know how I feel, thank you. Or they're trying some way to help me be less sad, thank you, right? In those more graced moments where we don't have the luxury of hiding from ourselves quite so much, we are compassionate towards these people, even though we see that what they're trying to do for us is totally irrelevant to our experience.
Well, in
right?
a way, they're not trying to help us. They're trying to feel comfortable with themselves.
The difficulties that are
And that's
coming up.
clear, and we don't hate them for it. We're not rejecting them. But what we are so wanting in those moments is someone who can be with us. Can I be with you? Again, I come back to this. Being is being with, right? The suffering in here or with my friend. And just as you were saying, I don't care how traumatized a person is. I don't care what culture they come from. You take any human being on this planet, and when they feel somebody sitting with them, really seeing them, really being with them, that allowing sense, it's going to be safe to come out to play.
I think you touch on, I think we have, after food, shelter, all those, we have 4 basic needs.
Yeah.
To be seen, to be heard, to have a sense of connection, and a sense of belonging.
Yeah.
And if we don't get those, we may survive, but we're not going to thrive. And that sense of being seen, I think, at least I learned how to relate to my emotions, like, come on in, you're welcome to be here if you'll go away.
Yeah, it helped me enormously when I stopped thinking of my ego as something bad and started to recognize it as the traumatized, scared, lonely child inside me and how that child was trying to survive. And I then saw that spiritual techniques that were in some sense actually a rejection of my ego were a rejection of that child. And in the rejection of that child, the chance of any integrated self, a true wholeness, how could there be wholeness? I've got a huge split in me against that part. What kind of wholeness is that? It makes no sense. Another great Hamid quote, transcendence is repression. That doesn't mean there aren't transcendental qualities of consciousness, but as we are all saying, those qualities meet the patterns, meet the suffering, meet that lonely kid inside. They're not leaving him to flounder, right? They're holding all of that. What is, again, fascinating, though, is how our sense of self gets built out of how we manage the feelings of that child. That's really what the ego is. Right? It's people were say was being said by Mr. Chopra and Mr. Spira. Was that last night? Yeah. Time flies when you're in the bardos, right? That ego isn't a thing; it's an activity in our consciousness, right? And it matters. Right? So there's a way of, how can I say it? There's an intimacy with experience that is the hallmark of a genuine quality of realization. There's an intimacy that develops with reality, with other people, with myself. It's and that is precisely what trauma disconnects us from. Right? That intimacy with reality. And that's why there are various states of consciousness humans can get into that kind of look like that, but they don't have this sense of connection, intimacy. There's no texture to them.
Yeah.
Right?
I also want to go back to Julie's, your last question, because I think you hit on something about going too soon into something, into the trauma, and how that can have
Re-traumatizing and devastating effects. Yeah.
And then, and just for the sake of addiction, that can be exactly what sparks somebody to relapse. Because if you're going down too quickly into something very painful, the body's response has always been use something.
Yes.
Which is a coping mechanism, in a way. And so there's real danger in that, of how you work with people with trauma and what pace you make. And the other thing I want to make on that is that, we have developed a form of inquiry, but one thing that I'm always telling myself or practicing myself and telling the facilitators that we train is that you can't stay within any box, because part of being with somebody is being flexible and to be able to adjust how you're relating to them in any moment. You mentioned it too, Richard, is like, when do you go into the phenomena and then when do you pull back to kind of rest, or when do you enter in things like CBT or whatever else you're going to add into, and understanding to be flexible so that you don't treat people as if they're all the same, and that there's a formula to fix them, and that takes experience and practice and actually listening, compassionate listening, and being present. There's the word. To be present to it.
Well, I think this is that place of deep listening we're talking about. When we really are with a person, we're really listening to them. We're not oriented of how am I going to help them or fix them. To me, the helping comes out of the moment that arises out of that deep listening and welcoming the person just as they are.
And that's so often what the child didn't get, or the infant didn't get, in the original traumatic events. So that presence that you're all speaking to so beautifully is so important. And in that space, if you observe a person, you can see this natural innate capacity for the body to begin this organization that is moving towards healing. And of course, I think there are a lot of skilled interventions that we can use to facilitate that. We don't want to have an agenda for how it's done, just like you were saying, Scott. Each individual has their own unique way of resolving.
Yeah.
But I do think that there are, following that strain, there are tools, I call it a toolkit or tools for life. I think there are tools which we can learn. Who here got the owner's manual when you were born? I think that there are tools here that we can learn, because as I was listening to you, Scott, I was reflecting that healing trauma, whether it's from war, whatever, takes time. And to think that in 6 weeks we're going to heal through it is a mistake. How do we set a context, as you're saying, Russ, where people can come and begin to learn the tools and begin to engage that healing, where they can begin to really feel the faith is here. Not hope, but faith. Hope is based on fear. Faith is based on things will turn out the way they're supposed to. But where they can get those tools, and then when they go back into life, they understand the door is open here. They've got to have that community of support as they go back at it and apply these tools, which are going to take years to really integrate in.
I would like to say, though, agreeing with what you're saying, but also saying in the many people that I work with, sometimes hope is the only thing that they have.
That's the starting place.
Yeah. And the experience of hope, how they experience that. So exploring what hope is to them. I just wanted to add that.
Yeah. For me, hope is such a big deal. It's one of the 3 Christian virtues. I think hope is the birth of realizing that we're not broken. There's nothing wrong with us, essentially. That doesn't happen for a person all at once, of course. But any dawning of my okayness is, for me, the heart recognizing, wow, I'm actually loved. I'm actually beloved of the universe, right? Any movement in that direction. And just to piggyback on what you guys were talking about, obviously in my line of work, I'm teaching the Enneagram, and we would say there's at least 9 ways that you might show up with people. But interestingly, when I teach people about facilitation, coaching, or therapy in the Enneagram, people always expect an algorithm. What? Like, okay, I'm coaching a 2 now, what do I do? I'm coaching a 3 now, what do I do? And a lot of people teach it that way. I don't go that way at all. I want every one of our facilitators to feel the 8, the 9, the 1, the 2, the 3, the 4, the 5 within themselves, and to be conscious of the unconscious agenda of what I think you need to be okay. Like so many spiritual schools and techniques there's an idealization of some particular state of consciousness, and it's usually a valid, real one, but it's not the whole thing. How could it be? And so there's this sense of us who are doing this work with people, being in an ongoing practice of broadening the discoveries of our own countertransference issues, right? But to really see, what does it mean? This is a very hard thing to talk about. I want to help. I want to do something good. I see this suffering person in front of me. I want to do something for them. And mostly what I will come up with automatically is out of my history, my trauma, my programs, and I'm going to lay that, okay, that's what I know how to do for you. But as we're looking at this whole non-duality piece, which is very important, there is a way that with that tools and training, and it's like being a musician, right? I've actually practiced my instrument. I know how to play the violin or the guitar or the piano. I've done my practice. But now, here I am. It's time to play music. It's time to create music. There is a receptivity of consciousness. There is a not knowing which brings forth the understanding of what is actually happening moment by moment, this spontaneous and effulgent quality of interaction. And when it's actually happening, I never feel like I'm doing it. Mm-hmm. Have you ever had a successful experience with a client or a group where you felt like you were doing it? Maybe afterwards say, boy, that was a good job, right? But not while you're doing it. Something else is happening. And I think that, again, this comes back to trust. We can't go there, even as facilitators, if we haven't developed some trust in that capacity, right? And so that's what we're trying to help our clients with too. How do we trust this reality when we have so many good reasons in our mind not to? And we have come to trust these mechanisms. They've worked well enough. Hey, yeah, they've created a lot of suffering, but it seems the devil I know, right, better than the one I don't. So I'm just, again, speaking to the place where genuine non-duality is found is not snug and comfortable and familiar. It's absolutely a dive into the vulnerable, alive, shimmering unknown of this amazing, mysterious existence that we find ourselves in.
Beautiful. Yeah.
Yeah.
Very lovely.
I was going to say one other thing, just to piggyback on what Richard said.
Yeah.
As we had the center, the one thing that we found out is that if you don't give people skills to help them be with their experience as it shows up after they leave the center, the relapse rate is much higher. So it was really a matter of necessity. Because if you're working with somebody on trauma in a session, one-on-one, and there becomes this clarity that dawns, and relaxing of a lot of the responses, and the thoughts are getting quiet, and they're not really very triggerable. The thing is you put them back into life, and all the triggers are there, the environmental cues are there to re-trigger the trauma. So that's another thing that's really, I want to, what having sat with all this stuff for a while now and having done this work, as I look at how we're conditioned in our society, we learn or we developed tools to suffer in a way. Like, even if it wasn't taught to us that way. It's like the thing I was telling you when you're young, they don't feel the fear, there's nothing to be afraid of. Anger is not appropriate, stop crying. So there's this set of tools right there. And then get in your head, understand and label all of reality. And if you can understand it that way, you've achieved something. Go to school for you, they'll give you grades for it. Okay, so we learned a tool there. So we've learned all these tools as a way to get out of our body.
Yeah.
Learning that caffeine covers up feeling is a tool. Or that when I take this painkiller, I don't have to feel. That's a tool we learn. So, the whole idea of the fix-it culture that we live in, to me, doesn't make sense. Because when you come into this work, and neither does it make sense that you just have an awakening experience and then it's all gone. What makes sense to me is that this non-dual context that we're talking about is merely the background, the thing that allows, if one can cultivate it, allows a deeper exploration. And then you actually teach people skills to how to relate to their experience in a more loving, gentle, vulnerable way. And that's something that's not talked about a lot in some teachings, the skill building and giving that. But the reason that I've been okay talking about it is because of the work that I do as a matter of life and death. Yes. If you don't teach them that, they can either relapse and go to jail or spiral down for 30 years or die. Yeah. So I've just, it would be nice if we could kind of have that mutually supporting each other, that tools are okay, like ways of relating to experience are different, because we've been picking them up since we were age whatever, and just change.
Tools are one of the most important things we can give to our patients or our students, because we want to empower them. We don't want them to keep coming to be in the presence, of you three are teachers, and to be okay in that space, but to be able to go out into the world and to learn how to regulate their own nervous systems, to be able to develop the capacity to feel the whole spectrum of human emotions, which is the richness of life. If we deny ourselves any of those emotions, we're denying ourselves, spirit itself. We have this wonderful finite self, which is a vehicle for the infinite to express it through, and it includes all of our human experience. And I think that's very important to know. I do want to move on to one more or another question. And this has to do with, in meditation, coming up to places where we meet this void-like place that can seem very terrifying. And a lot of the meditation traditions teach us how to reach that space in a very compassionate or gentle way, or a very soft way, and it can be very, very profound. And in trauma, when we're working with trauma, we can come up against these same places. It feels like we are coming up against death, because typically in the experience of trauma, it feels like we're going to be annihilated, and that's why we disconnect, or the authentic self or the soul disconnects. So there's a beauty in both working with trauma and working with meditation and meditation techniques simultaneously. I wonder if all three of you could speak to that, your views on that.
There's a piece that comes to my mind. If we've nourished this feeling of being, and I think it's one of the differences in the non-dual approach, if I use that language, we're really coming from an orientation that there's something here that hasn't been traumatized, hasn't been hurt, doesn't need healing, and you as a person don't need healing. There are pieces that are broken that do need healing, and here are tools, but we're using the tools not to fix or change the essence of who we are. If we've nourished that, and we've helped a person explore as these realms of thought and emotion and sensation are arising, that we're both connected to them, so we're feeling them, and we're, in a way, welcoming them back into our psyche, so we're connected with them. And yet, we're also exploring how we're the one who is aware of them. We're an essence that is not just this. And we do that over and over again. Then when one of our clients meets this void or this emptiness or these states that can arise when we're working with someone in trauma or in meditation, they can learn how to navigate them. And I'll give a real life example. I was working with a woman when she first came to see me. She was sleeping with a gun underneath her bed. She was addicted to alcohol and different painkillers. She was in an abusive relationship where she was being hit all the time. And as I worked with her and worked with these different qualities, and she began to feel her emotions awaken her body and begin the initial phases of healing, she came into my office about a year into our work, and she came in with black and blue marks on her throat. Her boyfriend had just tried to strangle her. She had been able to get away, call the police. He was in jail, and she was sitting in my office. And so I asked her, I said, in this moment, can you describe your experience? And she said, well, actually, I'm up in the wall over there, and I'm looking down.
Yeah.
And I said, so you feel like you're dissociated? And she said, yeah. Now, this is built on a year of work, slow, patient work. I said, can I ask you a question? She said, sure. I said, are you in your dissociation, or is your dissociation in you? And her exact words back to me were, are you telling me that I've never dissociated? And I said, no, I'm just asking you a simple question. Are you in your dissociation, or is your dissociation yet another experiencing unfolding in your awareness? That was actually the beginning of the end of her dissociation.
Yeah.
She began to realize that the experience of dissociation that she had been fusing with was just another experience, just like voidness or emptiness or fullness or any state. And that really began the real deep work, where she was really then beginning to welcome in all the traumatic instances. But she was able to meet them now from that perspective of, yeah, I'm experiencing this, I'm feeling it in my body, and yet I'm something more, and grounding and weaving that sense of being and well-being in and amidst all the different traumas. And she actually said to me a few years later, she said, if you're ever at a gathering like this and I'm in town, call me in and I'll be happy to tell you about what dissociation is and how to heal through it. So,
Yeah.
There's something about gathering all of those parts of self that actually never came into being. And when that happens, there's a sense of wholeness that we experience that allows us to know that we are so much more than the sum of our parts. And that's what can really allow this deep and profound connection to happen to ourselves, to others, and beyond. That is so fundamental to being a human being.
and picking up what you were saying, Scott, that this denial, I feel like we've learned to treat our emotions like as if you're going over to your neighbor's house and you knock on the door and you say, you know, I'm having this grief or I'm having this emotion, can I come in and talk with you? And we just want to sit there and connect. We don't want to be fixed or changed. And our neighbor subtly says, you're sure you're welcome to come in if you'll go away. And to me, until we really can welcome ourselves, not from that perspective, but really truly feeling you're all welcome here.
Yeah. Right.
And I'm not here to get rid of you, but to really...
Rumi's guest house.
Yeah.
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 So Julie, with your question, did you mean, when you spoke of the void, did you mean the dissociative void or the...
Well, it can be either. So it was just an invitation to have your thoughts on that. And I think, trauma and spirituality, they are, two seeming paths that go together really well. That if we are specifically on a path of wanting to open up to non-dual awareness, we may miss some of these trauma experiences that are really creating suffering within us that we might actually be unaware of. And at the same time, being on this journey of resolving our healing trauma can really open us up in a very profoundly spiritual way. So because really healing trauma is bringing back our life force energy back into our body.
Yeah.
So there's at some points where we meet that place where the original traumas might have happened that were terrifying, right, that have the potentiality to really, if we soften into them and open up, that's where we can really open up to these places of non-duality, but in a very embodied way.
Yeah, this is a really good conversation because my experience has gotten richer through feeling and getting in touch with those parts.
Yeah.
You know, and so going back to hope, you know, it's not a word that I usually use, but what we'll use at the center is maybe encouragement to share and give context to people to say, this is what's happened for me. I've been through trauma, and I've worked through it, and as I've worked through it, my experience has become richer. I feel more alive. I'm more connected to my body. I'm more aware in my body. Just to give them a sense that it might be okay, because they don't know where they're going with this.
Right, yeah.
You know, so there's that. And I think to help them understand the difference between void as in the sense of, oh, there's just this awareness, and the dissociative void, and finding out what it is that they're afraid of.
Mm-hmm.
So if it's an external stimulus, like maybe they're in a room with people and they're sensing that a certain male or female is threatening, or just male or female energy. One of the things with the unfindable inquiries that we use is to help see the emptiness of something. It's not just the emptiness of self, but to see the emptiness of other things and threats. So instead of going straight to the dissolving of self, which is sometimes a big step to go
Probably
into when
not
you're
what you want to do.
You don't want to do that. Not right off the bat. But what about a perceived threat that you see? Let's say there's someone in the center that scares you and you're having this dissociative response. Can we just see that the threat itself can be deconstructed? Just that threat, which means that facial expression that you're seeing, and then that feeling that you may not want to feel, and sort of taking it at a really small level. Let's just look at that first, and is that okay? And can you see that that's not what you thought it was? And then piece by piece, and then bring them slowly back into the body instead of I don't even know how you would bring somebody into their body fully in a dissociative state all at once.
Well, I don't think it's our job to do so.
Yeah. But
No,
right.
You know,
Right.
and it will happen organically as the trauma resolves. So, you know, people think about, it's about getting back into the body, and
Yeah.
and who says so? What does the person
Where are
want? Where are they?
Where are they?
And on their timing.
Right.
Richard
There's a
said.
piece I'd love to take up on that, what you're talking about, Scott. When there is a perceived threat, where it may not actually be a threat, but where it still may be a threat, and to be able to develop and access information in our body that says, what's the most appropriate response for me to this that I am experiencing as a possible threat? So the threat itself may be real, and then I'm looking to see, I have the capability within me to respond in a way that's responsive and not reactive. And then I don't have to get into a reactive confrontation. So I'm looking at both, how do we look at the world and see how we're projecting threat where there may not be, and empty it out? Where are we projecting out and recognizing there is potential threat here? But I have within me a perfect response to this moment that's not violent, not going to create new conflict, but is actually going to move me into a resolution and a right action where I feel now empowered rather than the way I used to feel, which is helpless, hopeless, diminished through the trauma. Because I've been working with so many people who've been in war. It is a threat. And something happened where now they're feeling a sense of helplessness, hopelessness, incapability, total de-enfranchisement, and total disempowerment. And when I see that they're able to come to a new resolution where there wasn't anything I could have done, and to really own that, then there's a reclaiming of a sense of empowerment where often people say, I realize now I wasn't in control, and that's actually empowering.
Yes.
And so to make this discernment between our projection of something that is from our past we're projecting on, and actually we're projecting out unsafety or threat where there isn't one. and to make that discernment where there really is.
I want to add to that a little bit, because it's very difficult to have the body know that threat is actually not out there. And so I don't know if it's the most articulate way to say that the past, it's the past, because it's actually the present.
Right.
Even if something happened 30 years ago,
It's still in this present moment.
in this present
Right, so-
moment, and the body is perceiving threat, even though the mind is saying, "Oh, don't be silly. There's nothing to be scared of."
Yeah.
Well, I think that's where, if we have that resource that can meet it,
Yeah.
we're actually activating, we might say, the hippocampus that can see the context, can see the consequences of any action we may take as a possibility.
Right.
We're not being held hostage in that moment by the limbic system, although it's firing off with fear or whatever it is.
Yeah.
But we're able to hold a larger perspective that allows us to access that intelligence of information that does know what to do in this moment. I'm convinced we all know what to do, but all of our conditioning shuts down those possibilities. If we can access in that moment that ability to have perspective in the midst of the crisis,
Yes.
we can move through it in a way that is healthy.
Right.
Yeah.
And you just said that, and that the mind, even when the mind is saying that it isn't a threat, and the mind is often saying that, but also the mind is presently saying that it is a threat. So even in present time, it's saying that also.
Yeah, yeah.
And so if you take, there's someone sitting right there, who's being perceived as a threat. Of course, from some perspective, the person's not doing anything; they're just sitting there, right? But this is why I like talking about the Velcro effect, because there are little ghost images in our mind that are already giving us examples of how this could become worse. They could become threatening. It's like the mind is very active around trauma, so it might already be active, giving us little ghost images of what could happen to threaten us. And if we can become really tuned into those little images and deal with each one of them one at a time, breaking them down, it's a real deep mindfulness practice, and can really help people in present time. Because we say that all trauma is past trauma, really, but it presently shows up. How does it show up? For us, it shows up through these images and words and bodily responses. So we would have to deal with it on that level, because that's how it shows up.
Showing up now.
Yeah, right now in that way,
Yeah.
through the responses. Yeah.
There's also the piece that comes in what you were saying, Russ. In that moment of real trauma or potential trauma, we're a social human being. Our genetic coding is kicking in. If we haven't learned how to accept our humanness, and that we are a social animal, and that our unconscious is making hundreds of evaluations that we'll never know about, is this a threat? Are they going to have me for lunch? Am I going to have lunch with them? Are we going to be friends, or is this a foe? So I think we've got to really mine, as we're healing, our humanness and accept that we are social animals. We are making thousands of critical evaluations as we're working towards any person, friend, foe, whatever, and to really accept that humanness and all the responses then, as you're talking about, Scott, I think then it comes as a full package.
Yeah, and just real quick, because I know what you want to talk about, that's a good point. And one thing we notice is that is to give people, to create a permissive space where people can go to the old coping mechanisms. Because it's not about healing and being diligently ready to heal and be awake to everything all the time. Sometimes you just got to go eat chocolate cake. You just have to. Or sometimes you have to get out of the room from somebody. And if you can give people that space to know that they can go back to the old coping mechanisms and then come back to the thing, I think that's helpful too. Otherwise, it can be overwhelming for them to, that's just another way of being human.
This is a very, very important point, Scott. I find that when I'm working with groups or students, let's say we're working on something that's in a potentially trauma-laden area of human experience. We do an anti-schizoid exercise at one point where we just shower people with loving attention. They just lay there and receive it. They can't say anything. They just, right? But the context of it is, I talk first is, and let's just guess that for a lot of us, certain cynical voices might come up. And we make space for that. They're welcome. They can be here too. Just let them come on in. Hey, yeah, this is all bullshit. I don't believe any of it. You don't really love me. But if we don't make the allowance for that other side of the self to be there, that subterranean part of the self is going to dominate the experience.
Yeah.
I think every emotion is like nested Russian dolls.
Yes.
I always say, look behind the emotion that's coming in, and all of a sudden we see a whole spread of, as you say, expectations, anticipations, judgments, whatever. So we need to fan them out and welcome. You're all welcome to be here.
Yes. Well, the only other thing I wanted to throw in the mix here, because you guys were covering this so beautifully, is we're talking a lot about trauma that is really the trauma of boundary crossing, abuse, violence, and so forth, which is a huge category. But I wanted to speak briefly to the trauma of neglect, where you're not paranoid someone's going to get you. You're just feeling nobody's interested, nobody wants you, there's no connection. You walk out amongst the tables here with the utter conviction that nobody here really wants your company. Right?
Yeah.
That is a big one for a lot of people, and utterly traumatizing, utterly debilitating, and it's so convincing, as all of them are. And I just want to make a space for the fact that there is the balancing of that to the recognizing the capacity of contact. You know, maybe first with myself and with you, but there's another. I'm sure you all in your work have encountered that too. I just wanted to put that in the mix here. The other thing I wanted to speak to, and I just feel moved to say this because this is a group clearly interested in these deeper questions. In my work, I've talked a lot. I developed an idea with Don Riso years ago about these layers that people pass through as they start to go through awakening process. Not linear, it's not lockstep, but they're all here in us in some sense, all these layers. But one of them that just never gets talked about much in these kind of metaphysical discussions is after you've gotten in touch with the rage and the sadness and the grief and the terror, and it's like the whole mechanism kind of finally gets released and burns out, you then hit an existential wasteland. No one talks about it. We get a little bit when we hear John of the Cross talk about the dark night of the soul, right? We come to a place where we see all of our metaphysical ideas, all our precious views about consciousness are bullshit. Bullshit. And there's nothing to be done. There's nothing to be done. This is where that being with and community, because we start to see that the more we try to manipulate ourselves to see it this way or that way, just keeps taking us further and further away. We feel the isolation that creates. Because this, I think, speaks to what you guys were saying about the fundamental trauma of disconnect. Right? In the movement toward the authentic connection, we experience that all the connections we thought were there aren't there the way we thought, even to God, right? We enter into this existential emptying out process. I call it God's waiting room, where you're just kind of sitting there and you don't know what to do, and it kind of seems like you're depressed. Everything feels phony. Yeah. Everything people say I say the sky is blue, I feel like I'm lying, right? Like everything feels false, and yet you know that's not exactly the case, and you're wanting something and you don't know what to do. I just feel larger and larger segments of the population are hitting this, and we might medicate them, think they're depressed. We might, any undigested trauma is sure going to be in your consciousness now. But I think there needs to be more of a holding and an understanding of us hitting this certain stage in the development, which I would guess there's a number of individuals in this room who either have been experiencing that or maybe even right now. Yes. There's a way, there's this place where you kind of know what's what, and you kind of know all that back before isn't the truth, but there's a process of you get where the idea of prayer came from, right? That it wasn't just people believing in some sort of cosmic father or something. It was actually a recognition of a kind of surrender that's needed. And of course, if we're still in some field of managing our unmanageable emotions that I mentioned even earlier, we won't even get to this place, or we will get there and bounce in and out of it until further notice, right? So just to say again that there's a lot of psychological work that's magnificent. There's a lot of spiritual work that's magnificent. What we're talking about here is more a psychospiritual journey, right? That it has to entail both levels of reality to cross these most difficult parts of the journey, the scariest parts of it. And yes, we can have experiences. We might tonight, right now, who knows when, we can have experiences where the universe reveals its majesty, I am that, it's fabulous. And sometimes we need those to keep us going. But also, if we're going to live that, or live closer to that, there has to be this process of metabolizing all this unfinished business in us. Yeah? Mm-hmm. And I just wanted to speak to this other place, which I feel is the what? Boy, am I going to say that? Yes, I'm going to say it. It's like we arrive at the collective trauma of humanity. Yes. Yeah, and here we are. And now what?
Yeah.
There is, though, one piece on that.
Yeah. Thank you.
That I hear you speaking to, and something for me doesn't quite ring true, and maybe it's semantics. Everything is being with. I think for me, my experience was there was a moment where it was no longer being with, unless you were saying it was being with being.
Bingo.
And
yes.
In that moment, the sense of connection with self really began to blossom.
Yes.
And it is an existential crisis, because until that moment, I think that there are subtle ways we keep looking out or looking for some mechanism that is going to save us. And in that moment, we realize, as you say, nothing has helped ultimately. It has driven us to this moment, and there is a giving up that either can become very nihilistic, depressed, or there's a moment of true giving up when we are just sitting, not with being, not in being, but that transition into being as being.
Yes.
And then what I see in my experience is value, meaning, purpose.
Yeah.
All of a sudden sprout, and they're not based on anything.
Right.
They are just what we are at the depth of our humanity.
They're intrinsic.
They're intrinsic
qualities of human consciousness.
And then what I see in sitting that with long periods of time, compassion, kindness, an inherent equanimity, joy, they all begin to sprout. They are intrinsic to us. And then we can truly become, I think, a human being.
Yeah. And we see at such moments that all this doesn't render all the skills that we've acquired in life meaningless. They are now congruent with
Right.
a growing sense of what it means to live a human life.
Yeah.
Yeah, then what a privilege this opportunity is. You know, it's easy to forget that.
But I wonder if some of what you're talking about comes from our very, very earliest experiences of trauma.
Yeah.
You know, touching back to coming into the body or coming into the world, or coming with the body and then not being able to incarnate into it because it's so terrifying. I mean,
Right.
This is existential terror, and being able to be with people, if we're working with them, and to drop into that space with them, because it's so terrifying when you feel you're there alone, and to be able to gently and very carefully and very compassionately and come out of that space. I don't know if that's the best language to use. And so on that note, I wonder if we can just touch, we've got a couple minutes left, or just maybe say a couple of words about, very, very early trauma, that we don't remember it explicitly, that it does live within us.
I think this is where we touch back into the point we were investigating earlier, because there is preconceptual, pre-verbal trauma that we may have gotten when we were in the womb, when we don't have the conceptual developmental language, and yet it's being embedded and encoded in us. our willingness to really sense the body and not analyze it, not try to fix it, change it, but just welcome it. To me, ultimately, that's where the healing is, in that true welcoming without the analysis, just being with, where there was some fundamental non-conceptual split that happened in us, a separation. And as we just feel connection is there, we're not needing to get reconnected, we begin to discover that it's always been there. We forgot it at a very fundamental level, but it is, all of us are going to be confronted with preconceptual, pre-verbal aspects that have to be just lived with.
Yeah.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
oh, I'm sorry. I totally agree with that too. The one thing that I noticed about my own practice is, the experience of when you close your eyes, of noticing as if you had a clear hose from the top of your head to the bottom of your groin, and you're actually surveying that experience of your body right in front of your spine, and the way that it manifests as sensation, but also the spine itself. The experience of when someone, like a roof collapses on people or a traumatic event happens, their body goes like this, like that, to protect themselves. But emotionally, I think we're doing that throughout our lives too. We're kind of contracting or constricting. And when you go into deep body awareness and you're there a long time, you start to notice where are the kinks in the hose,
Yes.
And then those kinks, sometimes it's a non-conceptual, pre-verbal thing that can get worked out by being really tuned into it, but even sometimes it has conceptual information, it has memories that you didn't know that you had, or some people have past life experiences, whether true or not, that's their experience, that they mine out that stuff. So that, to me, I totally agree with you that the body sensing level tells us it's a different kind of intelligence, than the elaborate frameworks of the mind. It's telling us something that's much more intimate and that we can discover. But the only thing I have to say about the body is gentleness is the key.
Yeah.
Gentleness and loving, caring, quiet attentiveness to the inner body, and just letting it show you where it has done this in response to things, whether you remember those things or not,
Yeah. So
Yeah.
thank you so much. And on that note, I need to say thank you to all of you.
Yeah.